My name is Maya Pearson. I'm 27 years old, and for most of my life, I believed that if you just tried hard enough, people who were supposed to love you eventually would. That belief didn't die slowly. It died on a Tuesday evening in March, at a graduation dinner I had waited 6 years to have, in front of my father's entire side of the family. When my stepmother stood up from the table, pointed her wine glass at me, and said the words that ended everything. She said I wasn't worth the seat I was sitting in. She didn't whisper it. She didn't pull me aside. She said it loud enough for the whole restaurant to hear, loud enough for my aunt to stop mid-bite, loud enough for my cousin's boyfriend, who had never even met me, to look down at his plate in secondhand shame. My father sat right beside her and did not say a single word. Not one. He just folded his napkin, smoothed it across his lap, and looked somewhere past my shoulder like I was already gone. I had spent 6 years working double shifts at a diner and taking night classes to finish my degree. 6 years of skipping vacations, skipping dinners, skipping everything that cost money I didn't have, all so I could sit at that table with a diploma in my bag and finally feel like I had done something that mattered. I wore a dress I bought secondhand and steamed 3 times to get the wrinkle out of the collar. I had rehearsed what I was going to say when my father raised a toast. I had imagined the moment so many times it almost felt like a memory before it even happened. Instead, I sat there with my face burning while my stepmother told the table that the only reason my father had paid for anything in my life was out of guilt, and that guilt had officially expired. She said he owed me nothing. She said I had used up every bit of goodwill this family had to offer, and the least I could do was stop pretending we were close when everyone at that table knew we weren't. I didn't scream. I didn't cry in front of them. I picked up my bag, pushed my chair back carefully so it didn't scrape, and walked out of that restaurant with my hands shaking so badly I had to grip the door handle with both of them just to get it open. The cold hit me the second I stepped outside. It was one of those early spring nights in Indianapolis, where the air still hasn't decided if it wants to be winter, and I hadn't brought a coat because the forecast said 52 degrees, and I was trying to look nice, not practical. I stood on the sidewalk outside the restaurant for a moment, half expecting my father to come through that door after me. He didn't. I started walking. I didn't have a destination. I just knew I couldn't stand still. My apartment was 40 minutes away by bus, and I had missed the last direct line, so I walked to the nearest stop and sat down on the bench under the yellow haze of a streetlight and told myself to breathe. My diploma was still in my bag. I had pulled it out twice at the table, trying to work up the courage to show them, and both times I had slipped it back in because the moment never felt right. Now I sat there with a degree I had spent 6 years earning and nowhere to go, and no one who cared. That's when a woman sat down beside me. She didn't look at me right away. She set a leather briefcase on the bench beside her and pulled out her phone and typed something, and I paid her no more attention than you pay anyone at a bus stop at night. But then she looked up and said, quietly, "Are you Maya Pearson?" I turned to her so fast I nearly dropped my bag. She was somewhere in her late 40s, with reading glasses pushed up into dark hair and the kind of composed expression that belongs to people who deliver serious news for a living. She wore a navy blazer and sensible shoes, and she was looking at me the way someone looks at a person they've been searching for, steady and careful and relieved. I said yes before I even thought to ask how she knew my name. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a business card and held it out with both hands. Her name was Patricia Cho. She was an estate attorney with a firm in Carmel, which was about 20 minutes north of where we were sitting. She said she needed to speak with me about my grandmother's estate. I almost laughed. My grandmother, on my father's side, had been dead for 3 years. My mother's mother I had never met, had been told she wanted nothing to do with us, had been told she was cold and distant, and had cut off contact before I was even in school. That was the version of the story my stepmother had told me so many times. It had become the only version I knew. I told Patricia I thought my grandmother was gone. She shook her head. She said, "Your grandmother, Ruth Eldridge, passed away 8 weeks ago. And before she did, she spent the last 2 years trying to find you." The bench felt like it shifted underneath me. I want to be careful here, because what I know now and what I knew in that moment are very different things. In that moment, I knew almost nothing. I had a name I barely recognized, an attorney I had never met, and a story that contradicted everything I had been told. But Patricia didn't ask me to trust her. She simply asked if she could show me something. She opened her briefcase and pulled out a manila envelope and laid it on the bench between us. Inside was a photograph. An older woman with silver hair and my mother's eyes, standing on the porch of a yellow house, holding a small chalkboard sign that said Maya's room, with an arrow pointing to the window above her head. On the back, written in careful cursive, were the words, "I kept this ready for you. I just couldn't find you fast enough." My throat closed entirely. Patricia let me sit with it. She didn't rush me. After a long moment, she explained how she had found me, because I needed to understand that before I could trust anything else, she said. My grandmother had hired a private investigator the year before she got sick. The investigator tracked down several of my old addresses, but each time he reached out, the letters were returned unopened. Patricia believed they never reached me. She believed they were intercepted. A neighbor of mine, a retired teacher named Mrs. Garland from the apartment I lived in 2 years ago, had stayed in touch with my grandmother's investigator, and when she saw my graduation announcement posted on the community board at the library, she called Patricia's office that same afternoon. That was 3 days ago. Patricia had been looking for me since. Before I tell you what happened next, I need you to do something for me. If you have ever been told that someone who loved you didn't want you, and you found out later it was a lie, hit like and leave a comment below, because you are not alone in this, and neither was I. I didn't go home that night. Patricia called a car, and we drove to her office, which was quiet and lit warmly and smelled like coffee and old books, and she laid everything out on the conference table in front of me, piece by piece, the way you lay out a puzzle when you're finally ready to see the whole picture. My grandmother Ruth had lived in a 3-bedroom house in Carmel for 30 years. She had a savings account, a small investment portfolio, and a piece of land outside Noblesville that had been in her family since before I was born. She had no other grandchildren. She had one daughter, my mother, who died in a car accident when I was 4 years old. After my mother died, my grandmother had tried to stay in my life. She had sent birthday cards, holiday cards, and eventually letters directly to my father's house asking about visitation. She had called. She had driven to our neighborhood twice. Every single attempt had been turned away. Patricia slid a folder across the table. Inside were copies of letters I had never seen. Some were addressed to me by name. Some were addressed to my father asking for news, asking for photos, asking just to know I was okay. At the bottom of one was a handwritten note in my grandmother's script. It said, "I don't know what they've told her about me. I just hope someone tells her she was wanted." My hands started shaking again, but differently this time. Not from the cold or from fear. From the particular kind of grief that comes from understanding what you missed and why. Patricia gave me a moment, and then she continued. My grandmother had updated her will 18 months before she passed, with one significant revision. Everything, the house, the land, the savings, was to go to me. She had also included a letter to be delivered to me personally upon her death, which Patricia now set on the table in a sealed envelope with my name on the front in the same careful cursive I had seen on the photograph. I didn't open it yet. I wasn't ready. What Patricia told me next was the part that changed the temperature in the room entirely. She said that 3 weeks after my grandmother passed, someone had contacted her firm claiming to represent my interests. This person had submitted paperwork requesting that the estate be redirected, citing estrangement, and claiming that I had authorized them to act on my behalf. The signature on the authorization document had my name on it. Patricia pushed a photocopy across the table, and I looked at it for a long moment. I had never signed that document. I had never seen it in my life. She watched my face carefully. She said she had suspected as much. The signature didn't match the sample she had pulled from my college enrollment records, and when she ran the paperwork against my known addresses, she found that the contact information listed was not mine. It was a P.O. box registered to a name I didn't recognize, but whose address, when traced, came back to a property owned by my stepmother's brother. I sat back in my chair and let that land. My stepmother had been intercepting my grandmother's attempts to reach me for years. And now that my grandmother was gone and had left me everything, someone connected to my stepmother had tried to redirect the inheritance before I even knew it existed. They had forged my signature to do it. I thought about the graduation dinner. I thought about my stepmother standing up with her wine glass and telling the whole table I wasn't worth the seat I was sitting in. I thought about my father sitting beside her and saying nothing. I asked Patricia one question. I said, "How much?" She turned to the next page in the folder. The house alone was valued at just over $400,000. The land outside Noblesville had been appraised recently at $260,000. The savings and investments together were just under $90,000. I pressed my hand flat on the table to steady myself. Patricia said gently that this was still early and that the forged document needed to be investigated properly before anything could move forward. She said the estate was currently frozen pending review, which was standard procedure when fraud was suspected. She said she had already flagged the forged authorization with the probate court and had contacted a forensic document specialist. She also said that she wanted me somewhere safe while this process played out. She asked if I had anyone I could stay with. I thought about my apartment. I thought about my father's house where I had grown up. I thought about the restaurant, the folded napkin, the empty seat where my apology should have been. I shook my head. Patricia didn't hesitate. She called someone, and within 40 minutes I was checked into a quiet, extended-stay hotel with a room that had a window facing east and a lock. I controlled myself. She handed me a prepaid phone and told me not to use my personal cell for anything related to the estate until she advised otherwise. She also said, "Get some sleep if you can. Tomorrow we start building this the right way." I didn't sleep. I sat on the edge of the bed with the sealed letter from my grandmother in my hands and stared at it for a long time before I finally opened it. It was 3 pages, handwritten. She started by telling me about my mother, the things she remembered best, the way she laughed, the way she held me in the hospital the first time she saw me, the look on her face that my grandmother said she carried with her every day. She told me about the house and the room she had kept for me, with the yellow curtains I could change if I didn't like them, and the window seat where she used to read in the mornings. She said she didn't know what I had been told about her. She said she hoped it wasn't too terrible. She said that whatever it was, she wanted me to know that not a single day had passed without her thinking about me, and that if I had ever felt unwanted or left behind, she needed me to understand that was never, ever the truth. At the very end, she wrote, "You are your mother's greatest gift, and you were always mine. I'm sorry I couldn't find you faster. Please take the house and make it yours." I sat with that letter until the sky outside the window started turning gray. The next morning, Patricia called early. She asked me to come to her office and bring any personal documents I had with me. I had my diploma in my bag from the night before, a copy of my lease, and my driver's license. She also asked me to write down, as specifically as I could, every memory I had of my stepmother referencing my grandmother, every time the subject had come up, and anything I had been told. I sat at the conference room table and wrote for almost an hour. I wrote about being told my grandmother had asked not to be contacted. I wrote about the one time I had found an old birthday card buried in a kitchen drawer when I was 12 and asked my father about it, and my stepmother had answered for him, saying my grandmother was unstable and it was better not to dig things up. I wrote about the Christmas when I was 15, when I asked if we could try to reach out, and was told in a voice that closed the subject that some people choose to walk away, and we respect that choice. Patricia read everything I wrote and nodded slowly. She said it was consistent with what she was already seeing in the documentation trail. That afternoon, her colleague, a forensic specialist named Dr. Warren, presented the comparison between my actual signature and the one on the fraudulent authorization form. The differences were significant. Letter formation, pen pressure, the loop on the lowercase y that I have written the same way since middle school. None of it matched what was on that document. Patricia filed an amended report with the probate court before the end of the day. What happened over the next 2 weeks was not dramatic in the way people imagine legal processes to be. It was quiet and methodical, and involved a great deal of waiting in rooms with fluorescent lighting, but piece by piece, the picture became impossible to deny. The P.O. box, tied to the forged authorization, was traced to my stepmother's brother, who had a previous civil judgment against him for a real estate transaction that had gone wrong. A subpoena was issued for financial records. Those records showed a payment made from an account connected to my stepmother to her brother's LLC in the days immediately following my grandmother's death. My stepmother had known about the will. She had known for at least a year, possibly longer, and she had moved quickly, before the estate was formally announced, to intercept it. My father, when contacted by Patricia's office, initially claimed he had no knowledge of any of it, but Patricia was thorough. She had records of a phone call between my father's personal cell and the P.O. box registrant made 2 days after my grandmother passed. He knew. I sat with that for a long time. I sat with it the way you sit with something that doesn't surprise you and also destroys you at the same time. Because deep down, in the part of me I had never let speak out loud, I had always known that his silence was not neutral. His silence was a choice. Every time my stepmother spoke over me, dismissed me, sent me to my room so the adults could talk, his silence was not absence. It was permission. The graduation dinner was just the first time he had run out of the energy it takes to pretend. Patricia asked me if I wanted to be present at the probate court hearing. I said yes, without hesitating. I want to tell you what that room felt like, because it mattered. It was smaller than I expected, with wood paneling and a judge who looked like she had stopped being impressed by people's excuses sometime in the 90s. My stepmother arrived in a beige blazer and pearl earrings, which I recognized as the outfit she wore when she wanted people to think she was reasonable. Her attorney was polished and spoke quickly. He suggested that the whole matter was a misunderstanding, that the authorization form had been submitted in good faith by someone trying to protect the estate during the period before I had been located. Patricia let him finish. Then she placed the forensic comparison on the exhibit table. Then she placed the phone records. Then she placed the financial transfer documentation. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't editorialize. She simply stacked the evidence on that table, the way you stack the truth when you've been careful enough to let it speak for itself. My stepmother's attorney asked for a recess. The judge denied it. When my stepmother was asked directly about the phone call to her brother, she said she didn't recall making it. When she was shown the record, she said she might have called about something unrelated. When she was asked what unrelated matter would require a call to the registrant of a P.O. box connected to a fraudulent legal filing, she looked at her attorney, and her attorney looked at the floor. My father was not present. His attorney submitted a written statement claiming no involvement and requesting to be considered separately. The judge noted the statement and moved on. At the end of the hearing, the judge ordered the fraudulent authorization voided, the estate released to me as the rightful beneficiary, and referred the matter of the forged signature to the district attorney's office for criminal review. She also ordered a forensic audit of any financial transfers related to the estate during the period between my grandmother's death and the filing. My stepmother walked out of that courtroom without looking at me. She got into a silver sedan and drove away, and I stood on the courthouse steps and breathed the cold air and felt something leave my body that I realized I had been carrying for years. It wasn't anger. It was the particular exhaustion of waiting for someone to finally see what you already knew. Patricia stood beside me and didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "The keys to the house are ready whenever you are." I took them 3 days later. The house was yellow, just like in the photograph. The porch creaked when I walked up the steps, and there was a clay pot by the front door with a dried-out plant in it that someone had been tending until recently. I stood there for a long time before I put the key in the lock. Inside, the air smelled like cedar and old books and a faint trace of lavender that I guessed was my grandmother. The room with the window seat was at the end of the hall, exactly where the arrow on her chalkboard sign had pointed. The curtains were yellow, the same shade as the outside of the house. A worn quilt was folded at the foot of the bed. On the nightstand was a small framed photo of my mother holding me as a baby, both of us laughing at something off camera. I sat down on that window seat and looked out at the backyard and let myself cry. Not from grief exactly, though grief was part of it. I cried because I was sitting in a room that had been kept for me by someone who loved me before I ever knew she existed. And I cried because I was 27 years old and I had spent most of my life being told I wasn't wanted by people who needed me to believe that, so I would stop looking. I had stopped looking for a long time. I was grateful I hadn't stopped forever. The weeks after the hearing moved in a different rhythm than anything I had known before. There were practical things, transferring utilities, filing paperwork, meeting with the estate accountant. There were also harder things. I started seeing a therapist, a woman named Doctor. Osei, who had an office in Broad Ripple with a plant in every corner and a way of asking questions that made you realize you had always known the answer. She helped me understand something I had been circling without quite landing on. The cruelty I had grown up with was not random. People who treat others like burdens are often protecting themselves from the cost of caring. My stepmother had not simply disliked me, she had needed me to be small so that my father's attention and resources stayed directed at her. My father had allowed it because choosing her meant never having to examine himself. My sighs, my silence, my willingness to disappear into the background was not a flaw. It was something they had worked very deliberately to produce. Understanding that did not fix everything, but it changed the question I kept asking myself, from what is wrong with me, to what did they need me to believe, and why? I started GED classes that spring, which sounds strange for someone who had just graduated from college, but let me explain. I had a degree in business administration, earned while exhausted, while working, while surviving, but there were gaps, things I had never let myself learn because learning took time, and time was something I had always been made to feel I didn't deserve. I signed up for a watercolor class on Tuesday nights. I joined a book club at the library 2 blocks from the yellow house. I planted something in the clay pot by the front door. My father reached out once, through a mutual cousin, asking if we could talk. I asked Patricia to respond on my behalf. She sent a letter explaining that any contact regarding the estate needed to go through legal channels, and that I was not prepared to discuss anything further at this time. I did not respond personally. Not because I was still in the fire of it, but because I had learned, slowly, and at some cost, that a door with no lock is not a boundary. It is just a door. My stepmother's brother pleaded no contest to a filing fraud charge. My stepmother was separately indicted. As of the last update I received, the case was ongoing. I did not go to watch. I had already gotten what I needed from that process, which was the truth in writing, in a courtroom, with a judge who had heard it. What I kept thinking about, in the months after everything settled, was my grandmother standing on that porch with her chalkboard sign. She had kept a room ready for me for 2 years before she found me. She had kept it ready, even when the investigators' letters came back unopened. Even when her calls went unanswered. Even when every avenue she tried went cold. She never stopped trying. She just ran out of time before she could finish. I thought about that a lot when I wanted to give up on things. When the therapy sessions got hard, when the legal paperwork stacked up, when my father's silence started to feel like another form of verdict, I would think about that room at the end of the hall and the curtains she had put up before she ever knew if I would come, and I would remind myself that someone had already decided I was worth waiting for, even when I hadn't figured that out about myself. The land outside Noblesville I kept. I wasn't sure yet what to do with it, but it was mine, and that was enough for now. The savings I used to pay off, the debt I had accumulated in 6 years of working and studying and surviving. I set aside a portion for the therapy I knew I still needed. I kept the rest because for the first time in my adult life, I was allowed to think about a future that belonged to me, and I wanted to be careful with it. I still live in the yellow house. The quilt is still on the bed. The photo of my mother is still on the nightstand. And sometimes, when the morning light comes through the window seat, I catch myself looking at it and thinking about the laugh on her face in that moment, and wondering what she sounded like, and what she would have said to me on the days when I felt most lost. I think she would have said what my grandmother eventually said in her letter. That I was wanted. That I had always been wanted. That the people who told me otherwise needed me to believe a lie, and I was brave to stop believing it. Here is the thing about revenge that I had to unlearn. I spent years imagining what it would feel like for the people who hurt me to finally see the cost of what they did. I imagined confrontations, apologies, some moment where they looked at me and understood the damage. That moment did not come in the form I imagined. My stepmother did not apologize. My father did not show up at the yellow house with his hat in his hands. There was no scene where everything was acknowledged and healed. What there was instead was quieter and in some ways more satisfying. A courtroom where the truth was documented. A house where I have a room with my name on it. A life that is mine to design. The most powerful thing that happened to me was not that they were punished. It was that I stopped needing their version of me in order to know who I was. If you have ever been told that someone didn't want you, I want you to sit with what I'm about to say. Sometimes that story is not about you at all. Sometimes it is about what someone else needed to take from you in order to feel safe or powerful or unbothered. Sometimes the people who should have protected you were too busy protecting themselves. You are not the role they gave you. You are not the silence they required. You are not the debt they manufactured to make themselves feel owed. You are someone who deserves a room with curtains and morning light, and someone who keeps it ready even when they can't find you yet. Tell me in the comments what name you want to be known by. Not the one that was used to keep you small, but the one that's actually yours. And if this story hit somewhere real for you, share it with one person who needs to hear that the truth has a way of showing up with receipts, even when it takes longer than it should. I'll be here. And I'm not going anywhere.